Hey there, Hour of History fans. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week we have Dr. Sarah Robey, an assistant professor of history at Idaho State University and an expert on the history of energy. Dr. Robey combines cultural history with the history of science in order to understand people's experiences in the nuclear Cold War era. She takes a look at how people sort of reacted to the threat of nuclear war and the use of nuclear power and a whole lot more. It's a really jam-packed hour conversation we have. Dr. Robey is also coming out with a new podcast this fall that you are definitely going to want to hear about. We start talking about it towards the end of the show. As always, we love hearing from you at Hour of History and taking your suggestions. Let me know how you like the show and if there's any guests you want to hear from in the future. I will continue bringing you great interviews with fantastic people. So thanks so much for listening on the Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, links, and more, be sure to visit our website at www.hourofhistory.com. And for all the book recommendations made during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello, welcome to Hour of History. Dr. Sarah Robey, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
So it's a pleasure to have you here on Hour of History, and you are one of the special guests that we have on the show who comes from a suggestion where an audience member says, you have to have this person on. She's doing great things and the world needs to hear about them. So it is a special pleasure to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about your position and maybe your background in history?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really flattering, by the way. So I work at Idaho State University now, and my title is Assistant Professor in the History of Energy, which is kind of a different sort of title for a historian. But the way I see my position is I work on sort of energy humanities, so thinking a little bit interdisciplinarily about the history of energy, and sort of how the history of science and technology and cultural history can contribute to how we understand the role of energy in our lives, past and present. I came at this because I'm a nuclear historian. I actually have the Temple University connection as well. So I graduated with my PhD from Temple a couple of years ago now. But coming out of that program, I pretty much self-identified as a historian of nuclear science and technology, and that is still the bulk of what I do now.
And well, first of all, let's just say great things are happening at Temple.
They are. Yeah.
And but it is an interesting discipline because we have this sort of unfortunate separation between the science and the humanities. How did you bring those two together?
Yeah, well, in my teaching, I think it presents a really great opportunity to kind of grab at students who aren't in the liberal arts, aren't in the humanities, aren't history majors. Because as you know, we teach a lot of general education courses, but the history of science and technology has so many valuable lessons for students of all disciplines. So I have engineers come through my class, I have health physics students come through my class, in addition to a whole assortment of other majors. And just trying to pick apart our past mistakes, our past successes, what failed, what succeeded, and how that got us to where we are now, using technology, especially we talk a lot about cars and steam engines in my classes. That gets to students, that resonates with students. And so, of course, being trained as a historian and not as a scientist, I have a lot of ground to cover and a lot of research I do before lectures, trying to figure out how to put relativity into layman's terms or things like this. But it's totally within the historian's wheelhouse to approach these topics. And you're right. I think we put these silos up, and some of those are institutional and bureaucratic, and some of those are just kind of intellectual silos. That's what the STEM people over there do. And yeah, we shouldn't be thinking like that. So what I do in my research, writing, and also teaching is try to break down those barriers and show how artificial they actually are.
Yeah, and that's a frustration that I've always deeply held, especially having taught grade school, where, it's just such a comment. Well, I'm not a math person, and I just get so frustrated because, even if you struggle with math, it could still be very important to the humanities, and I feel like the science is the same way. Do you find looking into the past is as or more productive than this sort of tendency people try to do, it seems, with science, looking into the future?
Well, I think that's a loaded question for a historian. We try with all our might to avoid trying to predict the future.
Mm.
But how I think about that is that we have to acknowledge that. Just let's take technology, let's take science out of it, but just technology, the machines and the tools and the applied science that we use in our everyday lives, we take for granted that that's how it works now. And we take for granted that, of course, it came to that logical conclusion. It didn't have to. And here's where contingency comes in, right? This kind of core toolbox of the historian is at any given moment, the trajectory could have changed. And so getting, especially students who are studying engineering, who are studying science at a university level, getting them to acknowledge that human agency is so much a part of the story. And it's not just the nuts and bolts machine history. First there was the wheel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there were boats, and then there was the steam engine and trains, and then there were cars. And there are no people in that story, right?
Mm.
And so when I am teaching students who might someday be doing work in these fields and these professions, they are the people in the story, right? So kind of using historical actors to demonstrate how much power we have over the world that we're in. It's not really about predicting the future so much as getting students to understand that they have a place in this narrative.
That's very interesting because I try to think of at least my relatively limited experience in the sciences, and it seems people are sort of relegated to word problems, if that. Do you do any sort of exchanges or cross-departmental work, or are we still sort of stuck in these silos, at least for now? Is it up to the students to kind of bridge it?
Well, I mean, I just finished my second year at Idaho, so I have big plans for the long term. But I mentioned that some of the siloing is very institutional, and it's less conscious action, as much as it's really hard to cross-list classes and to co-teach classes. So that's just one sort of very practical impediment to working across the disciplines and across the colleges. That is probably likely the case at most institutions. That's not something that's unique to mine. But one thing that I would really like to do in the next few years is develop a general education class that's History of Science, Technology, and Medicine, and it's a 1,000 level course, and students can take it to fulfill one of their gen ed requirements. And that way, I think that students from across the university start to see that course as an option that fits in well with their schedule. But then, once I get them in the door, we can start working through some of these things that I find so intellectually important. And that requires buy-in from the science and engineering departments as well, encouraging their students to take this class and that sort of thing. But that's the administrative weeds of a university.
Yeah,
we don't need to dwell in, but that's one way, actually very feasible way that I think we can start crossing those boundaries.
Yeah, and I think obviously it's an important thing that we need people who have this sort of vision to approach and to do. It seems to me, and you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but with technology and science, environmental history, things like that, historians are largely ignored until a disaster happens. Is that true? Is there like some sort of focus on disasters when it comes to these cross-disciplinary things?
Yeah, I think there is something to be said about the way trauma, or like you're saying, a disaster or a specific event kind of re-injects us historians into the public conversation, the present conversation. But even still, I think the kind of attention, like let's use natural disasters as an example. With the hurricane in New Orleans last weekend, everyone was talking about Katrina again. But environmental historians and people who study disaster in history would say that is even short-sighted. Just to look back to Katrina, we should be looking back centuries. To think about the settlement of New Orleans, to think about how policies and culture guided the development of New Orleans to make it so prone and so vulnerable to these weather events. So I think sometimes a traumatic event, disaster, sort of will welcome a historian back into the spotlight. But our tendency, I think, is to try to like blow out that timeline, like explode our periodization. And of course, that a lot of people just don't want to hear about, the 1830s when we're talking about Katrina or the hurricane last weekend or something like that. So there are limits to how a historian can contribute to public and present conversations. I think valuable, but I think there are limits.
And now we use that environmental sort of example of the hurricane, and we have historians can draw on centuries of sort of hurricane examples, whether or not people want to hear them or we are kind of fascinated by the present ones. But your work focuses on technology that sort of has a very specific periodization. Can you talk a little bit about nuclear energy as a power source and where that puts you in terms of a historical period?
Yeah, well, so my research, where I came at this topic was specifically about nuclear weapons. So, talk about periodization. We're looking at, there's some wiggle room here. Maybe 1939, maybe 1941, maybe 1945 with the start of that. But the atomic age is the period in question, sort of at the heart of my research. And so I see that as very much an immediate post-World War II or right at the cusp of the end of World War II kind of story forward. But there are all sorts of ways that you can pull that timeline out as well. You want to go back to the 19 teens and talk about early development about theoretical physics. If you want to go back to the 1890s and talk about X-rays and how people understood invisible waves or invisible powers. Like any historical story, there are ways there you could always jump back farther and farther and farther. But for the purposes of my work, I care a lot about how the average person or just the general public understands changes at hand happening to them right at that moment. And so that's why I'm so comfortable using this periodization concept of the atomic age, is because, August 7th, 1945, right after Hiroshima, people were calling it the atomic age, right, at the time. And so I am really interested in how people understood the meaning of that transformative moment. And I look at how the subsequent years, ideas about the atomic age changed among people experiencing it. And that nomenclature never really went away, right? People held on to this term, the atomic age, for a very long time. Arguably, we're still in the atomic age. So as far as thinking about like period and timeline, I'm a 1945er.
Yeah, and a general comment like that, obviously, it's so cool to have historians. This is why I do the discipline. But I love how historians are always kind of saying, well, not so fast. I mean, we can tie it to the 19 teens, even if it's nuclear energy. It's just a cool feature of history that I hope everyone appreciates as much as I do. Now, when you're dealing with average person, what does that mean? Who is average? I've been called average before, but I don't know.
Yeah, and it's a very valid question, and one that I really wrestle with in my writing. I want to get past, we have a lot of great stuff written about people who are involved in the Manhattan Project, people who were in the Atomic Energy Commission in the 50s, policymakers, congresspeople. Like, we have a lot of great top-down sources to think about the role of nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, nuclear power in at least in the United States case. We have great top-down sources for that. So when I say average American, it's kind of a blanket term, but what I'm looking for are sort of grassroots sources, people who don't necessarily have a lot of power in the changes at hand, but who are thinking critically about them, who are thinking deeply about what that means for them or for their families or for their communities. So average American, again, it's an imperfect term and one that I probably lean on a little too heavily. Yeah, but I'm looking for just not anonymous voices, but people you've never heard of. What were they thinking? And what can that tell us about the zeitgeist of the moment? And also, just changes in popular opinion or the variety of public opinion as well.
Yeah. So I'm going to push a little on this only because I just earlier today read an article that got quite a lot of pushback on Twitter from The Economist, who one of their criticisms in this article that clearly wasn't written by a historian was that historians are too often nowadays focusing on these average people who don't really matter when they should be focusing on the people who were in Congress or the people who were in the Manhattan Project. Why does it matter what the average person thought and what the public opinion was?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, heavy sigh.
Yeah, exactly. But it's something we hear over and over, right?
Yes, absolutely. Like, these people don't have power. They weren't decision makers. Why do we care? Well, so there's a practical answer, and that's sort of, I'll reiterate what I just said, that we know those stories. Or we know a lot about those stories. And so to give ourselves a better rounded picture of the moment, and also the cultural turn has sort of weighed very heavily on what historians do and what they think matters in history. But, here's our unexplored kind of area, right? Why not look to these voices that we haven't considered before? And what can that tell us, especially in conjunction with looking at these top-down voices? Right. That kind of bringing that nuance together. I'm not ignoring senators. They're throughout my book, right? Yammering on and on about civil defense and atomic energy and stuff. But there's a whole other part of the story that we have either not had the tools to access or we've just largely ignored because these people seem powerless. So that's like the practical consideration, but the kind of more philosophical answer I have is one of the reasons I got into studying the atomic age and nuclear culture in America is we look back on that era with such, we inject what we think about that time with so much kitsch and sometimes ridicule and, look at these people hiding under their desks during a bomb drill. That's, how dumb were they being? These are atomic bombs, right? We look back and we kind of trivialize and infantilize these people in the 50s. And that gives them totally short shrift. That completely flattens a very complicated dynamic of what people were thinking, the real fear people had about nuclear war, and the real tangible actions they took to try to meet that new condition in their lives, to try to either mitigate the possible threat or, the kind of civic engagement that a lot of my actors get involved in to start either protesting certain things or writing letters to their elected officials. This was a real, genuine reaction, and it's not monolithic. So the like I said, the philosophical reason I think it's so important to talk about these quote unquote average voices is so that we don't trivialize what people did back then, and also we can correct the public memory a little bit of that time.
Hmm. Yeah, and it is interesting that you mentioned this word that I'm very interested in. It's certainly something that we have not lost, fear, and it's something that you can relate to across times. But at the same time, I was just talking with someone recently about how I think people forget how much fear was in the Cold War. Um, and I can't obviously speak to it because I wasn't alive really,
Yeah.
but you know, from stories I've heard and from histories I've read, the sense of fear seems a little different. Do you get a sense of the fear being different? Is it relatable? Does it teach us lessons? How does fear work in your atomic age?
Yeah, well, fear drove a lot of people to do things and think things and say things. That's just at the most basic level, of course. But uh, fear does not provoke the same reaction or actions in every single person, right? Some
Mm.
people found the most comfort in the 50s is just ignoring it, ignoring the nuclear threat, the threat of nuclear war. Um, and especially like later into the decade and into the early 60s, I have all these really kind of very, very dark sources about people who are just saying, you know what, there's nothing I can do about this. I'm just going to continue living my best life,
Hmm.
and come what may, right? But that's one reaction to fear. Another reaction to fear is something very concrete. Some people stock their pantry with some food and water. Some people built bomb shelters. Not very many, I
Hmm.
should admit. Um, Other people like took to the streets and protested about nuclear weapons, about nuclear testing, about civil defense recommendations. So, and all of that is driven by fear,
Hmm.
and a genuine fear, right? And I get the sense from all the different ways I've researched this topic that these questions were pretty unavoidable, especially late 40s, early 50s. These questions of will the Soviet Union attack us? Will the next war be atomic or nuclear? It would have been, you'd have to be living under a pretty big rock
Hmm.
to not have any component of this present in your lives. So that's the other thing to consider is like, this was a ubiquitous topic of discussion and concern. Not everyone did anything about it, but nevertheless, it would have been hard to escape the topic just in general.
So do you find, is it unfair to sort of say that uh, no there's no sort of analogy for present day that kind of
Uh,
equals how widespread it is, or is something like climate change that's creating just as much fear in some people, maybe not as many?
mhm. Well, I think climate change is an interesting analogy, and one that I think is productive and useful to think on. I think people talk a lot about how the different generations are kind of approaching
Mm-hmm.
climate change with different new urgency. Everyone's talking about how Generation Z is just going to like burn the house down because they're so mad about what happened, and the millennials are here trying to work with people and make some concrete solutions. And the boomers don't care, right?
Hmm.
That's the hot take on Twitter that
Yeah.
that gets reposted over and over again, right? Baby boomers, they have other things to worry about. But so I think the difference right now, at least in our moment with climate change, is we're starting to see, these vastly more powerful weather systems creating things that we're conveniently calling natural disasters, forest fires and all this stuff. And we're starting to see the consequences of that. The difference, I think, between our moment and climate change and say like 1950, right after the Soviet Union got atomic weapons, things are kind of ratcheted up. We've got the Korean War happening. I think the kind of tangible or visible consequences of the nuclear threat, they were more present for people in 1950. I think there are a lot of people in this world that can ignore climate change right now.
Hmm.
But I'm not a climate scientist, but fast forward 20 years, and I think that's going to be really different. I think we're just now starting to see those really, really visible consequences of climate change, and that's only going to exacerbate over the coming decades. And once that threat from climate change or the actual destruction of climate change is felt by more people, I think we'll kind of come closer to the sort of ubiquity of fear that we might talk about, say, in the early 50s.
And one thing we always have to consider, especially with a country like the United States, is that it's so massive. Do you find in the atomic age, and this certainly, like you said, climate change is productive to think about in these cases as well. Do you find in the atomic age that takes in Los Angeles were very different than takes in Washington, D.C. or fear in Idaho? How much did geography matter?
A ton. Short answer. The geography mattered a lot, and the technological change over time really matters a lot. And so, what I mean by that is, from the day after Hiroshima or the week after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people started kind of turning this revelation inward and started thinking about what the consequences for the United States would be, even though at that time the United States had a nuclear monopoly. No one else had nuclear weapons. From that point forward, the primary targets were assumed to be New York, Washington, D.C. Like if there were two, it was New York and Washington, D.C. Primarily because these are center seat of government, population centers, economic powerhouses, industrial powerhouses, and population, right? So, and that never really went away. New York always has this kind of, we imagine that is the kind of cultural heart, vulnerable heart of our nation, and DC as the kind of practical governing heart of our nation. But once the Soviet Union got atomic technology in 1949, for the next several years, the assumption was these things would still be delivered by bombers, by aircraft. And, even at that time, we had the capacity to shoot down a fair number of incoming aircraft, and they were slow comparative to later developments of missile technology. So the kind of speed and assumption of the scale of destruction was much slower and smaller from World War II until sort of the late 1950s. So how the weapons are being delivered matters, because by the late 50s, we've got missiles that can deliver things fast, quickly, and can't be shot down quite as easily. And then the other component is that in the early 50s, we developed thermonuclear weapons, or hydrogen bombs, you might call them, which are orders of magnitude larger than the sorts of explosions we were talking about with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is all to say that, in the earliest years of the atomic age, I think coastal cities, particularly on the East Coast, felt very vulnerable. But as the scale of weapons increased, as stockpiles increased, and then as delivery vehicles kind of increased in speed and sophistication, suddenly, if you live in Kansas or Idaho or the middle of nowhere, suddenly you're not as safe. Right? You can't imagine yourself as safe as you once could have. And then, of course, the other thing I didn't mention is sort of the revelation that fallout, even if you're not affected by the blast of a nuclear weapon, fallout radiation can be very damaging and deadly, even if you're nowhere near the explosion. So from 45 until the early 60s, there is this tremendous change over time in what the nuclear technology meant for how people assessed the personal threat based on their geography.
And we're talking about, well, at least you've been talking in the last few minutes about nuclear technology that's used as a weapon.
Yes.
What about nuclear technology that is not used in a weapon form?
Yeah. So are you is the question about how people see that as a threat, or what role that played?
How did people, because people knew nuclear weapons, that was a danger, and then all of a sudden there's also this nuclear power that is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Were people trusting? Was there a fear there? Because the United States started using nuclear power, right?
Right. Yeah. So there in the early years of his presidency, Eisenhower came out with this idea for Atoms for Peace, which was this kind of international program to share peaceful uses of nuclear technology. And kind of the cornerstone to that, or the keystone to that, was nuclear power production. And the development of that within the United States, for nuclear electricity, but also the promise that in the future the United States would be willing to use or to share its atomic or nuclear expertise with other nations, so that they too could benefit from the bountiful future of, the phrase that we all kick around is it's the electricity too cheap to meter, and that has a little bit of a dubious provenance, but it's useful for our discussion right now that this electricity will be too cheap to meter. And that will bring prosperity and health, across the world. So there's the cynical way of looking at it, and it's that was just a PR move to kind of counter the fear of the kind of monolithic imagining of the nuclear. It's a really jargony phrase, but to counter the imagination of the nuclear as purely a thing of destruction. But there were also really strong diplomatic reasons why Eisenhower wanted to push for this, right? If the United States can posture as being the carrier of goodwill, this has gets some negotiation traction with the Soviet Union. Perhaps we can coerce the Soviet Union to look more peacefully at nuclear technologies. So it's very much all caught up. It's a Cold War story, right? It's all caught up in how the United States and its leadership is positioning itself in the world, and then also how we kind of create a cultural antidote to nuclear is bad, right? Nuclear weapons are bad. And so, I think there are a lot of different push factors for why we really settled into nuclear power production in the 50s. It also required us to adjust our laws to make nuclear technology and nuclear information a little bit more accessible so that we could commercialize nuclear power. So the Atomic Energy Commission had to relinquish a lot of its control on the secrecy of nuclear technology and information in order to make that happen.
And once this knowledge or secrets got out, and once the information spread and these places opened, what was the perception? Was there more fear? Like, we're talking about places, in Washington and Idaho that are producing nuclear power, and presumably these people know and have feared nuclear power for a long time. I just feel like if this sort of thing happened today, where someone said, no, this technology is good and we're going to build it in your backyard and it's going to give you jobs, people wouldn't trust the government. Was that the case back then as well?
Yeah, short answer, yes. So I think one thing that really conditioned cultural responses to nuclear electricity, nuclear power plants from the get-go was that the first encounter that the average person had to anything nuclear was the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? That was our first kind of cultural encounter with this technology, and it was really hard to kind of shake that off, right? To shake off kind of the association with destruction, death, illness, and this sort of thing. So, the cultural historian in me thinks that is really, really important. And the federal government put a ton of, they were nuclear energy's biggest booster throughout the 50s and into the early 60s. So I mentioned we changed our laws to make this possible, commercialized nuclear power possible. The first nuclear power plant that went that contributed to the grid was in Shippingport, Pennsylvania, out in western Pennsylvania. And the federal government put a lot of money and expertise into rushing to get that online, to prove, to demonstrate to the public, right, this is feasible. But that electricity could not compete, even by a long shot, with the kilowatt cost of the other electricity sources available in that area at that time. We passed another round of legislation that protected commercial power plants from from kind of liability in the event of a meltdown, of a catastrophe, because there are all sorts of industries, power utilities and power industries that are looking at this saying, no, we don't want to touch this. Like, this seems way too risky, way too expensive right now. It's too new. And so Washington met that with all of these assurances, both monetary and legal, to protect this industry that they wanted to grow up. And then, to answer the question about did people look at this with skepticism, yes and no. I think there was so much conversation in sort of the public sphere about atoms for peace and atoms for war, atoms for good and atoms for evil, that I think people understood that certain aspects of nuclear technology and nuclear science could benefit them. Right? By that time, we already had pretty interesting things happening with sort of nuclear medicine that people may have encountered in their everyday lives. The promise of cheap electricity had been part of this conversation since very, very early on. Even a lot of the Manhattan Project scientists thought that that would someday be possible. And so I think that people were accustomed to hearing about the peaceful uses of the atom. And so on one hand, you've got this residual fear from it being first understood as a weapon, but also this kind of ongoing awareness that, maybe we can eke something good out of this. Maybe the atomic age doesn't have to be all bad. But throughout the rest of the 20th century, nuclear power plants have encountered public resistance over and over and over again about safety concerns and fear, to go back to that.
Right. And is this some of the civic engagement that you talk about, or is the protests are rooted in this fear of nuclear power as energy, or is that mostly based against nuclear weapons?
I think they're impossible to separate, right?
Yeah.
I think it's really, from a cultural standpoint, it's really impossible to kind of partition off how we think about nuclear weapons and how we think about nuclear power. And a lot of people have tried. A lot of people, a lot of officials and industry leaders and other boosters of nuclear power. A lot of people have very consciously tried to separate these things, but I don't think it's been very successful. So down to the very kind of nuts and bolts of the thing, the same sorts of reactors, or at least in the early days, the same sorts of reactors that produced the first usable and much touted nuclear electricity, those were the same reactors that made plutonium, right? And that's a thing we use for bombs. So at its very basic level, atoms for peace and atoms for war are really bound up with one another. And I think the ongoing protests about nuclear power plants throughout the rest of the 20th century and into 21st is kind of rooted in some way to this inability to separate those two things.
And it seems like that remains an international issue with countries like Iran and North Korea. It is, so you're saying that it's not really possible, even though many people have tried. Is nuclear energy then always gonna kind of like doomed to? Now I'm making you kind of go into the future, which is unfair, but is nuclear energy kind of always tainted with this sort of nastiness? Because we have this fascination with things like Chernobyl and the new HBO series. I just can't take my eyes off of it. You see what happens when things go wrong. That's a powerful cultural imagination.
Oh yeah. And you even talk to people about 3 Mile Island, which I was not alive for, but being in this field, you often hear people's remembrances of certain flashpoint events like Chernobyl, but also 3 Mile Island. And I think there's this very popular assumption that 3 Mile Island was like a huge disaster, that people died and lots of people were exposed. And nobody died, and the radiation that was released was pretty minimal, and it could have been a lot worse. But the way that has translated into our popular memory now is very much, I think some people might put 3 Mile Island on the same level of disaster and destruction as Chernobyl, which they were very different classes of nuclear accidents for a lot of different reasons. But to think about, is nuclear always going to be tainted by this? I mean, there are ways that you can have nuclear power and not use that to make weapons. So with Iran, you have limited centrifuges, for instance. You have limited kind of raw materials. You have inspections, right? Inspections are the key to actually that deal, is people coming in and making sure they're doing what they promised to do. But like I said, when it comes down to sort of the technology and the expertise needed, I think all of those negotiation points about Iran, at least before we sort of abandoned that, were about containing that nuclear capacity to only be about electricity and nothing more. So we put all these safeguards around letting that get bigger and out towards the scale of enriching uranium for nuclear weapons, for instance. So there's always the possibility that if you have the expertise for one thing, you can do the other thing.
It's very interesting too with this, because you just explained it from the sort of scientific perspective, where it is scientifically possible to have energy without having necessarily the means or the ability to turn it into a weapon. But at the same time, you can kind of see the cultural underpinning of like how, well, the U.S. doesn't really trust Iranians.
Yes.
And so that's fascinating. And so right there, again, we kind of have this meeting of the cultural and the technological. Mm-hmm. But who has this kind of understanding now as a historian? And so you're looking both at the ground level, and obviously you've done a lot of reading at the top levels. So you see the average people and the top government lawmakers. Does anyone sort of see both sides of this, or do you usually have a story of someone who gets it technologically or doesn't have a cultural read? Are there people who see both ways?
Yeah. I don't know. I couldn't tell you a name though. I'm sure those people exist, right? I'm sure there are people out there who are having very nuanced, putting out very nuanced thoughts and ideas about the kind of broader landscape, specifically with Iran. And you do see this with people who are talking about the role of nuclear power in our kind of energy portfolio moving in farther into the 21st century, whether or not we can accommodate nuclear power as a pretty green, not perfectly green energy, to think back to climate change and getting away from fossil fuels and carbon emissions. There are some people out there who are talking in really sophisticated ways about acknowledging both sides of the cultural and the technological. When it comes to policy, I get really frustrated because the think pieces that are out there, and then what's coming from especially American officials about, and I'm thinking about Iran again, but I get really frustrated because it's never balanced in that way. We're either just addressing kind of the technical aspects, or we're addressing completely just like the overwhelmingly horrible idea of a nuclearized Iran, like not in any nuanced way, but just like what you're saying, the kind of cultural Iran plus nuclear is a problem. Mm-hmm. It spells disaster.
And I suppose that's where, and that's why your work is so cool. That's where the sort of experts, like that's your job, is to somehow get this information out there. And well, obviously in writing, that's one way you're getting out there. You're teaching in Idaho, you're teaching undergrads, the next generation to think and consider in these ways. That's cool. You're also involved in a new project developing a podcast. What's that all about?
Yeah, so I'm working on a podcast with a colleague of mine who's at Georgetown. His name is Anthony Eames, and we're. I guess I should tell you about the overarching project at Stevens Institute of Technology. They've got a big grant that's called the Reinventing Civil Defense Project, and the main mission of the overarching grant is to kind of reconsider what nuclear public safety, i.e., civil defense, could look like or might look like in 2019, given our very different threat landscape today versus the early Cold War especially. And so that project is looking at all sorts of interdisciplinary modes for thinking about public communication and thinking about emergency management and some cool stuff like that. My part in that broader grant is I'm working on a history of civil defense podcast. It's called Duck and Cover, because obviously it's called Duck and Cover. And so it's going to be just a quick series about some of the thematic aspects of Duck and Cover as kind of the core of civil defense in the 1950s, but also looking at things like bomb and fallout shelters and kind of how that played a role in American culture in that moment. And then anyway, so the podcast is kind of a thematic approach to thinking about civil defense in the early Cold War. And we hope that longer term we can keep the podcast running and kind of broaden it to more with kind of a nuclear culture, nuclear history bent to it.
Yeah.
So you can look for that probably in November or December of this year. We'll be releasing the whole season all at once.
Oh, okay. And now, is this series going to feature international perspectives, or is it looking at the United States? What are some of the disciplines that you hope can contribute to the project?
Yeah, so we're mostly looking to historians. Most of our guest experts, interviewees are historians, and it is rooted in the American story because that's sort of how we framed our audience. But the comparative aspects of civil defense in the United States versus places like Sweden or Switzerland or the UK are really, really important, we think, to this story. And so we're also featuring guests who can speak a little bit more to how civil defense and nuclear public safety evolved differently in other countries. So it'll be mostly US, but with this kind of comparative aspect pulled in as well.
Now, when I was sort of preparing for this podcast, and I go down these deep dark holes of like looking for pictures and things like this of civil defense, something that kept popping up was military defense and sort of like Marines training for nuclear fallout. What counts as civil defense?
Yeah, well, so civil defense has a kind of direct predecessor in civilian defense in the United States during World War II. And again, this is where the US example is different from other countries, especially in Western Europe. But it was articulated specifically as safety measures for the public and not for the military. And in fact, as policymakers in the late 40s, were trying to figure out how to approach public safety in the atomic age. There was a very conscious decision to make that a civilian-run agency for civilians. There was a very direct or a very intentional decision for that to not be supervised by the military, at least at its inception. And that stems, I write about this a little bit in the book, but that stems a little bit from concerns about a militarized public or what it means for democracy to have too powerful a military. And it also comes from budgeting. It was just too expensive to lodge the responsibility of civil defense and public safety in a big federal agency. It was much more cost efficient to kind of spread out that responsibility in the civilian world into the states and counties and cities. So the military absolutely had its own kind of set of policies that were developed and studies and things like this to address safety in the atomic age for the armed forces. But civil defense, as I look at it, and as it was sort of written into government bureaucracy, was something that was specifically civilian and not military.
Interesting. And one thing, though, and those separations are very clear and very intentional as they're developed. It it seems, at least just to an outside observer, and perhaps it's because I'm in DC as well, but it seems like the military becomes more engaged with civilian life, especially when it's outside of the United States, but in the United States as well. Um, I ca in the case of a like nuclear emergency, would civilian defense only be the first step before someone takes over, or is it imagined as like a sustained civilian response?
Yeah, well, so ideally, it is a sustained civilian response, and you've nailed one of the major things on the head here about uh, how civil defense went through various planning and kind of iterations throughout the 50s and 60s, and again, it lasted into the 70s and 80s as well. But there was all of this energy put into, especially continuity of government planning, to avoid the situation where after a widespread nuclear attack, to avoid a case where we would just go into martial law, right? That the military would just take over. But, if you kind of follow all of the threat scenarios and the planning scenarios to their logical end, most of the kind of highest ranking people who are studying this realized that no matter how well we plan this out and how many bunkers we build for federal officials, there's going to be chaos after an attack, especially the kind of attack we were imagining by the late 50s and 60s, many bombs, many cities. There's going to be chaos, right? And we didn't like to advertise that perhaps the military would have to step in and take control, but in reality, that's probably, who knows? We have no idea what would have happened. This never happened. But, in reality, the military would have had a lot of power in that post-attack scenario, especially in sort of the days and weeks after the attack.
Yeah, it is. It's just sort of captivating, and there's a million different hypotheticals you can do, and I for one am definitely excited about the podcast, and I will be tuning in for sure. We're drawing close to the hour here, and we're getting to the moment in the show where we make a suggestion that can be anything for the Hour of History podcast listeners. I'd like to give you the honor of going first. What do you have for us?
Well, so I was warned about this. I have been thinking a little bit about it, and it's something I sort of alluded to earlier in our conversation, and that's to remember that when we're thinking about the history of science and technology and medicine and all these related fields, the history of STEM, to remember that there are people in that story, and to acknowledge the human agency in all of this history. And you don't have to be a historian to recognize that, but just to remember that, that we have these gadgets and amazing technologies and really cool science at our fingertips now was the result of, centuries of a lot of people's decisions and actions and failures and successes. So that's my HISTEM, history of HISTEM plug, history of STEM plug, to remember the human in all of this.
That's very cool. Yeah, and I hope that this HISTEM thing happens. That's actually the first time I've heard it, but
it's a hashtag. You can find it on Twitter.
Oh, it is. See, and this is also like a little complaint I have about Twitter is you get so networked into your own hashtags that as a non-HISTEM person, but now I'm starting to think of all the technology that I'm missing out. Now, sorry, I'm getting off track because this is the suggestion section and I have more questions. This is a fascinating topic. I wish I was at Idaho so I could take one of your energy classes because I definitely did not ever take an energy class.
I don't think most people did. But.
Yeah, I know, but it's good. I'll ask another question before I get to my suggestion.
Okay, please do.
Tell me a little bit more about this HISTEM community. Do you know of courses like this that are going on elsewhere? How big is the community? Are you entrenched typically in certain areas of history?
Well, I mean, this is sort of an outgrowth. The hashtag is catchy, but this has a much longer kind of precedent in historical associations like the Society for the History of Technology, which is conveniently called SHOT, or the History of Science Society, HSS, and there's the history of well, anyway, there's several of these kind of sub associations that meet every year, like any other subdiscipline meeting, and are doing really, really great innovative work. And especially in SHOT, I feel like the history of technology, that's my home meeting. They're my people. Really like going to that meeting every year. I think especially in SHOT, there is a really pretty good growing attention to interdisciplinarity and the importance of that. And it remains to be seen how this translates out into us as faculty kind of implementing these in our different institutions. But anyway, so that's sort of where the community grew out of. And of course, Twitter is this kind of nice locus for finding out what everybody else is doing.
So there are courses going on elsewhere.
Yeah, you asked about courses. A History of Science and Technology survey class is not too uncommon survey course. If you're at an institution that has, especially the institutions that have strong engineering programs, it's not too uncommon to see that. And lately we've been trying to include medicine in that as well. So it's not just History of Science and Technology, it's History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. But not every institution will have that. And then, of course, you have to consider that some universities, like the University of Pennsylvania, right, have programs that are specifically cordon off science and society as a specific discipline and a specific field of focus too. So different places are coming at this differently. But like I mentioned before, I think there's an opportunity to especially teach these topics really early on in an undergraduate curriculum, and that they be useful in the long term.
Very cool. Yeah, that will definitely be something to keep an eye out for. And it is always interesting because as historians, especially at this level, you're kind of keyed into your own historical societies, and there's really cool stuff going on down the hall sometimes.
Yeah.
So very cool. My suggestion is actually to the listeners to make a suggestion, because this is now like the fourth or fifth episode that I've done totally on suggestion, and each time they've been totally awesome for me and enjoyable, because usually they're out of my wheelhouse a little bit, and I think it adds a lot to the program. So, and this does not limited to Hour of History, of course. Most podcast hosts that I know are very receptive to feedback and suggestions, and are more than happy to use their platform to kind of reach out for audience suggestions. So go out there and send an email, and I think most of the time you'll find that the results are pretty cool.
Yeah.
Great. Well, so are there any last words for us here?
Well, we covered a lot of territory, and one of the things that I find so interesting about nuclear history is it has all these tendrils out into all sorts of other parts of our society and politics, and so go ahead. Yeah, that's great. I'm very excited about this. We'll have to have you back on when the podcast is out and to talk about your book. We covered a lot of ground, but obviously there's a lot more to cover. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Robey. Thanks, Stephen. It was a real pleasure talking to you today.
All right. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. So long.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.